Let's talk now about Douma and the chemical attack or the alleged chemical attack. So you've done a lot of reporting on this, and it earned you an invite to the United Nations, I think an unofficial Security Council meeting.
Russia and China invited me
Russia and
to
China.
an area formula meeting of the UN Security Council. So yeah, it's unofficial.
And you went several times, I believe, right? You
3 times,
testified. Yeah, you testified at an informal Security Council meeting concerning the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, otherwise known as the OPCW.
Yeah.
We'll talk about the events in Syria and what you think about, the fallout there more generally later on in this podcast. But for now, I'd like you to share with us your reporting on what you called a cover-up by the OPCW.
All right. Well, going back to the Obama administration, Obama puts out the red line, where he says, "I'm not going to intervene in Syria militarily, except for this one condition, where the red line is crossed of chemical weapons use." And if you read his statement carefully, you see he wasn't just referring to the Syrian government. He also was referring to insurgents as well. He said by actors on the ground, which could mean both the government and insurgents. But for the insurgents who are then trying to overthrow Assad, the red line was an obvious incentive to carry out a false flag, because if you're struggling to overthrow a government and you're receiving weapons from the U.S. and their allies, but not direct military support, like you don't have an air force, and then you find out there's one thing that can happen that will get the U.S. to bomb on your side, that's going to incentivize you to carry it out. There was an article in Harper's Magazine a few years ago by veteran journalist Charles Glass, where a former U.S. diplomat told him the red line was an open invitation to a false flag. And that's what I believe happened on several occasions. I haven't looked at every single chemical attack in Syria, but in the major ones, Ghouta, Khan Sheikhoun, Douma.
Which one was the first one?
Ghouta, 2013.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was an actual chemical attack. There was sarin used. People died from sarin. But there's been so much countervailing evidence to that one, including James Clapper, the then top intelligence official, went to Obama and said, the evidence of Assad's guilt is not a slam dunk. And the term slam dunk, that was a deliberate reference to the term that George Tenet used when he was heading the CIA, when he told George W. Bush that the evidence of Iraq's WMDs is a slam dunk. So Clapper was deliberately invoking the Iraq WMD scam to warn Obama against bombing Syria over Ghouta.
Why do you think Obama made that specifically the red line? Like, there are a lot of things to make a red line, like killing civilians is a red line, or killing this amount of civilians, or dropping barrel bombs or artillery or whatever. Why did he make it specifically about chemical weapons?
Well, I don't think it was a well thought out moment. It was sort of impromptu. It was at a news conference. And he was asked about it. He was under a lot of pressure at the time, though, to do something in Syria. Because at the time, while he'd authorized the covert dirty war that most people didn't know about, he was resisting pressure to bomb militarily on the side of the insurgents. And I think the reason is obvious why. It's because he knew by then the insurgency was dominated by Nusra, by al-Qaeda and associated forces. He didn't want to act as their air force because he realized that the results could be catastrophic. So, and he was also under pressure. The Israeli government had been saying before then that Syria was carrying chemical attacks, and they were pressuring Obama to do something about it. So I think in response to the pressure he was receiving, as a way to sort of deflect, because I think he probably knew that Syria wasn't carrying out chemical attacks and they weren't going to, he said, this is the one thing that would change my calculus. So I don't think it was very well thought out. And certainly his aides regret that he said it, because he didn't ultimately enforce it, because he didn't bomb Syria over Ghouta. And the official reason is that because after Ghouta, Russia brokered an agreement to destroy Syria's chemical weapons stockpile, and that's why Obama didn't bomb. But I think he didn't bomb because James Clapper warned him it's not a slam dunk, and he didn't want to have a repeat of Iraq WMDs.
So the OPCW, this organization, they have these experts.
Yeah.
And they send people to Syria to do their research and investigate.
Yes.
And now I might be mixing up Ghouta with Douma, so you'll have to correct me about the specifics. But from what I understand, these experts went, and they determined that it may not have even been sarin gas. They took samples from like the walls of the site, and they determined that like this is not consistent with sarin gas. And then they sought the expertise of like other experts in Germany, and apparently they determined that we're not even sure that this was the specific kind of chemical attack they're saying. And then they gave OPCW, I guess, their findings, and in those findings, it did not say Bashar al-Assad was responsible for these chemical attacks, yet the OPCW's final reporting alluded to the idea that it was actually Bashar al-Assad.
Yes.
Am I getting that correct?
Yeah. So my first answer I gave you, I was talking about Ghouta 2013.
Yes.
And that's where there definitely was a sarin attack.
Okay, so that definitely was a chemical attack.
Yes. It's my belief that insurgents carried it out. And there's a lot of evidence to support that. That's now in the public record.
What sort of evidence?
Well, you have a study by Ted Postal and a colleague, Ted Postal, former consultant to the Pentagon, MIT physicist. He showed that the range of the rockets that were used in Ghouta could not have come from government-controlled territory. They did intersect with insurgent-controlled territory. That study is now widely accepted. The New York Times even had to publish an article in a really mealy-mouthed way acknowledging that Postal was right. Seymour Hersh later reported of a Defense Intelligence Agency document that said that al-Qaeda in Syria had a very advanced sarin program. There were people arrested in Turkey who were tied to Nusra with the precursors for sarin. There was a study done by some open source researchers a few years ago which showed that the rockets, the positioning of the rockets in terms of how they landed all intersected with areas that were controlled by the insurgents, meaning that, again, the evidence did not point to them being fired from government-controlled territory. And again, you have James Clapper, the head of national intelligence, going to Obama and saying the evidence of Assad's guilt is not a slam dunk, deliberately invoking the Iraq WMD scam. And other U.S. officials at the time leaked that as well. So that's an awareness inside the government that there was not the evidence to support it. And that's why, by the way, in a very unusual development, people ignore this or people overlook this. The U.S. government never put out a formal intelligence assessment at the time in making the case that Syria was guilty. The U.S. intelligence community never put out a formal assessment. That assessment that the U.S. government put out was instead authored by Ben Rhodes, who was a speechwriter for Barack Obama, who was a creative writing MFA, not an intelligence professional. And that's because we learned later, Clapper said the intelligence community will not be putting out a report. Because he knew, I think, the evidence did not support it, and he didn't want to be blamed for another Iraq WMD scenario. So Ben Rhodes, whose credentials include a creative writing MFA, not intelligence, authored what he called a U.S. government assessment, which is basically a press release. It's a glorified press release, not a U.S. intelligence community product, which requires analysts to sign off collectively on the intelligence to support the case. And Ted Postal is someone who poked a lot of holes in what Ben Rhodes put out there. So that's among the evidence. Along with basic logic, why would Assad, no matter what you think of him, do the one thing that he knows would invite U.S. military intervention?
Right, yeah.
When he's he has the advantage that he has air power. The insurgents don't. So why would he then give insurgents what they want, which is a pretext for the U.S. to come in and bomb? And by the way, at a time when he had just invited in UN weapons inspectors, Ghouta in 2013, when that happened, he had just invited UN weapons inspectors into the country to investigate what he said was a case of the insurgents using chemical weapons against his forces. So while these UN weapons inspectors are in the country, he's going to go ahead and launch a chemical attack, which then now they're going to go and investigate and possibly blame on him.
Yeah.
It defies logic, and it serves the interests of people who want to have war. And the same U.S. neocons who went to war of Iraq were all in on this allegation, and they've used that again. And again, so now going forward to Khan Sheikhoun and Douma, and Douma is the case that I've worked on extensively. Now you have the Trump administration in office. Trump had been saying before Khan Sheikhoun, the first incident in April 2017, that he wants to get out of Syria. He wants to abandon this goal of regime change. He already shut down Timber Sycamore, the CIA program to arm the insurgents. He wanted to pull out. Nikki Haley was saying we're no longer pursuing regime change. So again, you have an incentive there for the insurgents to basically try to reverse that. So then you have all of a sudden these chemical attacks. So this Khan Sheikhoun in 2017, Trump bombs Syria then, I think because he wants to disprove the Russiagate allegations. Also because Obama wouldn't bomb Syria. I think that Trump wanted to show that he was a tough guy, and he could because he hates Obama. He wanted to show that Obama was weak. According to John Bolton in his memoir, Trump said after one of the alleged chemical attacks, I think in Douma, Trump said, "My honor is at stake." Right? So Trump took this personally and wanted to show he was a tough guy by bombing Syria. So then you have Douma in April 2018, and this is where I think you have just the most overwhelming evidence of a false flag. So you have people being filmed in an apartment building, dozens of them dead, foam coming out of the mouth of many of the victims. They're collapsed in piles at the center of these rooms in this apartment building. And it looks like they've been killed very rapidly and just collapsed on the spot, which looks like sarin. And especially the foaming looks like sarin, because chlorine gas doesn't immediately cause profuse foaming from the mouth, and doesn't, if you have chlorine gas, at least some people are going to be able to escape, if not everybody. It's not a quick acting nerve agent like sarin, which kills you instantly and leads to foaming at the mouth. So, but the U.S. at the time says that this is that there's evidence that this is chlorine, and also maybe evidence that this is sarin as well. And before the OPCW can even get on the ground, Trump again bombed Syria over the allegation. But then the OPCW does get on the ground for the first time that the OPCW has actually been able to deploy a team on site to the site of an alleged chemical attack in Syria. Because before that, after one incident years earlier, when they tried to get to one site, they were attacked by insurgents. So after that, the OPCW stopped sending teams and instead actually farmed out their tasks to groups like the White Helmets, which are funded by the U.S. So in Douma, they get on the ground, they do an investigation. They put out one interim report in July of 2018, and then a final report in March of 2019. And these reports basically say that there's no evidence of sarin. As you said, there's no traces of sarin. And sarin is a very hard thing to cover up. If there's a sarin attack, it's going to be found somewhere. It's going to get into the walls, into the ground. You can't cover up a sarin attack. But yet, they found no evidence of a sarin attack. But the report does say that there are reasonable grounds to believe that there was chlorine gas used. And the obvious inference of the report, although it doesn't state it, but the obvious conclusion is that chlorine was used by the Syrian government, because only the Syrian government could have dropped chlorine gas from an aircraft, and there were cylinders found at the scene of the building where all those people were killed. So the obvious conclusion from this report is that Syria committed a chemical attack with chlorine gas. But then we get But then we get a series of leaks from inside the OPCW that undermine this claim and show that the original team that went to Douma wrote a report that did not find evidence of a Syrian government chemical attack and raised the possibility that this was staged by insurgents. But this evidence, these findings were censored. And the censored findings include the fact that after the Douma team came back, they got the samples returned from Douma, and they were very confused because even though this looked like a sarin attack, there's no evidence of sarin at the scene. And they didn't have any blood samples from the actual dead victims, which is odd because the White Helmets who put out the allegation in Douma, who work with insurgents and who claim to have buried the victims, didn't take, or at least didn't hand over, any blood samples. So at the scene, there was no evidence of sarin. And the original team was confused by this because it looks like a sarin attack, yet there's no sarin. So what is this? So they went over to Germany to meet with expert German toxicologists to try to figure out what had happened. And the Germans said, look, there's no way this was chlorine. These symptoms of people rapidly foaming at the mouth and dying quickly just do not make sense. Chlorine gas cannot cause that. Because in the time that you would develop the foaming from, if you've been hit with chlorine gas, you would have had time to escape. So chlorine gas will not cause such rapid foaming in the way that you die quickly and then foam at the mouth. If you're going to foam at the mouth, that has to come up after a certain amount of time, and it's just not going to happen with chlorine gas. So these toxicologists ruled out chlorine gas and said we can't figure out what's going on. If it wasn't sarin or another nerve agent, we don't know what happened. And one toxicologist even raised the possibility that this was staged.
Can you tell me the difference between chlorine and sarin, or is it the same thing and you use the words interchangeably?
It's very different.
It's very different.
Okay. Sarin is a nerve agent, a very deadly nerve agent that kills people very rapidly and causes things like profuse foaming.
Okay.
I mean, chlorine at certain levels is harmless. Like we know that from swimming in pools, right? And chlorine gas is just not known to be a deadly chemical weapon at the level that can slaughter dozens of people, have them unable to escape quickly and collapse. And we know, just if you compare images at the scene, the people at the scene who filmed the videos, they move the bodies around for a dramatic effect. So like in one scene, someone who was in a different shot, like just lying by themselves, is now seen hugging, like with their arm around someone else. This was done for dramatic effect. And so there was a lot of manipulation going on.
So that's confirmed. That's proven that same body was seen and is now moved to look like in a final emotional moment. Choking to death.
And there's a BBC reporter, Ram Dalati, who called this out and said this was ridiculous. And also he said that a scene A hospital scene that happened on the same day was staged by the white helmets to make it look as if people were being treated for a chemical attack, when really they just ran in, started hosing people down and filming it and making everybody scared that they'd been suffering from a chemical attack. Now, of course, just because bodies are manipulated doesn't mean that they're not victims of a chemical attack. But I'm just saying is that's one of the things that happened that add to the body of evidence that this might have been staged. But again, to me, the main proof is in the censored OPCW findings, including the German toxicologist who said, we can't explain what happened here because this was not chlorine gas. And if there's no sarin bomb at the scene, we don't know what caused these people's deaths. And I don't know what caused the deaths. I could speculate, but I don't know. I'm not a chemical weapons expert. The way to find out would be to have a credible investigation by the OPCW, which the OPCW has refused to have. They censored the original findings. They took the original team off of the case. They brought in new people, and they handed this case off to officials who didn't set foot in Syria and who reached a predetermined conclusion, I think. And they've ignored the dissenting inspectors who've tried to have accountability. They've refused to listen to them, refused to let them come in and air their concerns about how their case was manipulated. And they've refused to explain why all these critical findings were censored. I've written now a lot of articles on this topic. There's never been a substantive explanation of, for example, why did you erase the findings of the German toxicologist? And why did you even erase the fact that they were consulted? The OPCW team flew to Germany, which is a big deal, to consult with these people. And on the timeline of the mission, which lays out all the major investigative steps, like, May 2018, we did this. June 2018, we did that. Why was the meeting with the German toxicologists in June of 2018, why was that omitted from the timelines? Because they want to cover up what they found. So this was whether or not there was a chemical attack in Douma, it's undoubtedly confirmed there was a cover-up at the OPCW. Now, just because there's a cover-up at the OPCW doesn't mean there wasn't a chemical attack in Douma. I think, though, the covered-up findings do show that there was not a chemical attack by the Syrian government and that these people were killed in some ways that I still can't explain, and it made to look as if it was a chemical attack by the government.